And I'm Paul Rabinovitz, and just joining the group here after a couple of weeks, but I've watched your previous recordings, so hopefully I'm up to speed on the conversation.
Rose and Bob Dorr, we've been here every week, really enjoying it.
Rita Connell, I've enjoyed and I'm behind in the reading. No worries.
No problem. Chandler Navarrete here. I'm on chapter 2 in all transparency, but there's a mention of my alma mater in chapter 2, so I'm really getting into it.
I'm Carrie Nath here through Urban Abbey and made the connection through Urban Abbey, and likewise really enjoying the conversations and the ideas and learning.
I'm Sharon, and I'm also I also attend Urban Abbey, and I'm really enjoying the conversations here. Thanks.
My name's Jane Pilley. I'm new to the group this week.
Welcome.
Carol Bloch, I'm happy to be here. I missed the first 2 sessions, but I read the book, and when I saw the email, I just had to join. I think it was Earl that mentioned the book on a previous discussion group.
Hi, everybody. My name's Silvia Conley, and our book club read this book about 6 months ago, I'd say. So, but I love hearing more discussion on the book, so that's why I'm here.
I'm Barb Davis. I'm from Countryside, and I'm a conversation discussion.
I'm Fiona Kennedy. I've loved these book clubs so far. Looking forward to today. I used to be a tour guide at the Undesigned the Redline exhibit, which is a lot of it is based off of this book as well. So it's really exciting to hear some more conversations on this book.
I'm Caren Levine, and I've been participating in this, and I'm very happy to be here among this group. So thank you.
I'm Kris Hammond, and I've enjoyed the book, and you all have had some really great speakers. I'm just blown away.
I'm Susan Davies, and I've been enjoying being a part of this conversation. The book is difficult for me. It's just shatters so many, kind of basic understandings of what I've had about who we are. And so it's fun to, out of that difficult place, to have some conversation with people. I appreciate it. I'm a Omaha native, been away a couple different times, but it's good to be back with a lot of you who have a variety of experiences. I really appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. If we didn't get anybody, please chime in, or else I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jeff and Mike.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to hear from everyone. And those of you that maybe haven't introduced yourself, feel free to, in the chat, if you want to put your name and kind of who you're with, or how you found the study, that'd be great. We're very fortunate tonight to have Earl Redrick, the Field Office Director for Housing and Urban Development, and known Earl for several years. And a lot of what we'll cover tonight in the reading definitely connects to Earl's work, and looking forward to hearing his perspective and kind of what he's doing. But just Mike and I wanted to spend a few minutes just talking kind of at a higher level on the chapters 5 through 8, and this like combination, almost like a series of events around blockbusting, white flight, the Fair Housing Act, And then you have this like partnership between local nonprofit organizations that you receive IRS exemption, which we'll kind of cover that. And the faith communities are certainly a part of that. All these things kind of coming together in the from the World War II up to the 60s and 70s that we'll kind of cover tonight, that we're still talking about these things, very much so today. And then in that, so much about kind of what we're talking about today in the last 30, 40 years still gets around this idea of the local tactics, like what's happening on the ground, that were the outcomes of these policies were put in place, or when policies were introduced to address some of those issues, what other ways would local communities and people, whether it be local policy or local private interactions, when those things are happening at a scale, how do they lead to inequities based on race? And so we'll kind of cover that, the difference between kind of how we get to who has access to funding for lending, who doesn't, and then what we mean, as you kind of talked about last week with Angel, some of her story of who has access to home buying opportunities and who doesn't, and building that kind of generational wealth. This continues to come up again and again. Just in this last week or so, the president is somewhat of a national conversation. Actually, just today on NPR, there was an article about what does this mean to abolish the suburbs. When President Trump is talking about this term, most people may not know where this comes from, and he's talking about this Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act of 2016 or 15, and he says he's going to bring up this kind of new policy to replace that, and Secretary Carson talks about it as well. So it certainly is an issue that's not going away, this. Who has access to these suburbs or housing opportunities? What are the kind of factors today that whether that's student loan debt or stagnant wages and a rising cost of living, what's kind of holding people back, and why are we having difficulty building affordable housing? So these are some of the things that we'll talk about tonight, and we're really fortunate to have Earl with us this evening to talk about it. And I was out of town last week, so I missed last week, but I did watch the recording, and it was a very robust conversation. So I'm disappointed that I missed it, but I'm glad I was able to catch up. And if I didn't introduce myself, I'm Jeff Spies, and I'm a member of Urban Abbey and former, as of just a couple weeks ago, former colleague with Mike at the Metro Area Planning Agency. So I'll pass it over to Mike.
Yeah, so I'm Mike Helgerson. I'm a transportation and data manager with MAPA. I've been kind of co-leading the discussion here with Jeff on this book study. And I'm also a member of First United Methodist Church and attend there with my family. So kind of just to build on a little bit of what Jeff said in the discussion, Sierra provided a link to a story map that we put together. And a story map is just kind of a website that lets you explore a map and kind of scroll down through and interact with things in a way that you might not be able to with kind of a paper map. And so I'm going to drop a link to that into the chat here again. And I also wanted to share another story map that was just released last week that explores kind of a similar housing issue, and another book that we could have equally focused on here, similar to the rule of law, or excuse me, the color of law. Matthew Desmond's book Eviction, really kind of, or Evicted, excuse me, focuses on kind of the role that evictions play in housing access, and really kind of this, again, generational wealth issue that the color of law focuses on. And a couple of researchers from Creighton, from the Social Science Data Lab, did an amazing job of taking the narrative from that book and really kind of illustrating it. Talks a little bit about redlining, talks a little bit about the connection today. And so I'll drop that here in the chat for all of you to kind of look at on your own time. But I think Jeff, I'm ready to kick it over to Earl, and I'm sure we'll really kind of be able to kick off the discussion here. So Earl, I don't know if you're ready to go, but we're happy to hear a little bit from all of you about your experience working for HUD and how you're connected to some of these housing discussions.
I will do my best to help engage this conversation. It's oftentimes a bit daunting because I think I heard someone just say, and I can tell you, many of us who work at HUD, until we have the right mentors in front of us, until we have the right people that teach us. I've been at HUD over 15 years now, and in the last 8, I would say, is really where my understanding and focus of how early policies, not just at HUD, but across government, from HUD, EPA, highway transportation, how all of those policies laid out and really decimated communities of color. We can sit here and oftentimes we talk to people, but until you read and you see, there is a origin and there's a premise to these particular policies. People are not just grabbing this stuff out of the ethernet. But for many of us, until we read it, even those of us who work in the field, until we read it and then see it, it's kind of hard to conceptualize. So I'm here. I'm glad to dialogue with you all. I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time talking about my conundrums at HUD, and I do say conundrums. Public service is great. My entire career has been serving my country, military, and now as a federal employee. And things are not as nimble and as fast as we would like them to be, as Jeff can probably tell you. But I'm more interested in hearing from you all, your questions, your concerns. How does this stuff play out in Omaha if we don't know already? And what do we see or envision next? I'll tell you one thing, and then I'll stop, and I want to just have you guys, let's talk and engage me with questions. Last night, I just submitted one of my 2 papers for this semester. And interestingly enough, it was kind of in this space. It was supposed to be from a global perspective, and I didn't really know what to write about. And the more I pondered on it, I said, let me see how global poverty, the history of race, has impacted this housing space that we find ourselves in. And lo and behold, I found myself being even further enlightened on how we came to this, how the Americas or North America came to this space in policy development. They didn't think of that stuff by themselves. There's a origin and a premise to European colonization that this was their premise. We are the superior white race, and every country and every land they went to colonize, this was the model. And they handed it over to the leaders they left behind to colonize those particular lands. So I'll stop there, but that was really fascinating to me because most of us would think like, okay, America was just filled with so much hate and this and that. How did these guys just hatch up all this stuff together? No, they got it from their European ancestors who had a playbook on how to do this stuff when we colonized different new lands. So it was interesting to read. I really thought it was one of my best papers. It was a good write. So I'll stop there. Let me hear from you all, not from me.
So it's pretty ironic that this morning in the World Herald, I read an article about property valuations in North Omaha, especially after the book talked about how property tax had been used as a cudgel, as an instrument against communities of color to extract a disproportionate amount of revenue from those communities least able to afford it. And it just struck me that we're still having this conversation. Somebody who lives by Miller Park was complaining that they had a 77% raise in their property valuation in this calendar year alone. And so this hasn't changed all that much. And I would imagine that the people that work in that office would not for a moment believe that they're racist in any way, shape, or form. But I think it speaks directly to the point that Jeff was dancing around, that there's this sense of an innate superiority on the part of institutions. It may not be the people themselves that are racist, but the institutions for which they work, in which they operate, really kind of advance and promote those particular ideas. And if you happen to be at the wrong end of the equation, all you're going to feel is pain. And so, Earl, we're great friends, and I just kind of want to get your perspective on what will it take for these institutions to begin to step away from that modus operandi status quo.
In one word, if I had to share one word with you,
Do
leadership. Leadership. My focus actually in my program is public policy and leadership. And we not only do we need to see a dismantling of the institutions and the systems that they've upheld, but we need a new brand, a new model of leadership that's going to facilitate and usher in that movement. And without that, I just think we're gonna see exactly what you talked about, a retreading of those old policies, as Jeff talked about. And I don't want to get into politics because you guys know I work in the government, but a retreading of old policies. Like, well, what does that mean if we're right? So absolutely, one word. If I had one word to share with you, one area of focus, I would say we have to have leadership that is courageous, that is thoughtful, that understands these issues, that has cultural intelligence and cultural context to what is happening with these. These things just don't happen in a vacuum. They just don't, and they didn't happen just like starting last year or this century. They've been going on for a long time.
Thanks, Jonathan. Anybody else have a burning question from this week's reading or previous weeks?
Earl, I'm wondering, just this week, another member of Urban Abbey, the justice team, Jim Morley, he was a planner at HDR and retired a few years ago. And he said he's been reading this book, and he's got an aversion to Zoom, kind of Zoom burnout. So he wasn't going to be a part of this. But he said his family, he found out not too long ago that they a house that they owned, his grandparents on 25th and Spalding, had a restrictive covenant that and he has a copy of it, and he shared it with me on that. He said, and we talk about it in chapter 5, that restrictive covenants were prohibited after 1948. But as I was thinking about him sending that to me, and in Field Club, there's other neighborhoods. We have other copies that come in the historical documents in Omaha of other parcels that had this restrictive covenant. But so today, obviously we don't have this any longer, but there are through single family zoning, there's this kind of local tactics. There's still basically the essence of there's restriction and exclusion of where people of color can live. It's not by law, but it's
it doesn't
by
say
private
that,
practice.
But the implementation of the policy in effect has that. Has that impact? Yes.
So what gives you some hope? What have you seen with your colleagues at HUD around the country? What might be some good examples of ways that we can change that and make? Is it inclusionary zoning? Is it what? It's not. There's no silver kind of one answer for all of this, but as this was in this week's book.
So are we talking about to address the entire market of housing, or are we talking about like more affordable rental housing? Because I think it depends on what you talk about, what that looks like.
Yeah, more housing choice, diversity
choice.
of housing options. Okay. Yeah.
And Jeff, I think good question, and I think you've heard me say this, and I've had this discussion. Lots of respect for our mayor, and I've had this discussion with her and her team for at least 2 or 3 times since she's been in office. And what I've said to them is, we have to have a comprehensive housing strategy. We don't, right? When I look at Jeff, and you've been to Salt Lake City and Denver and Minneapolis, and then you slide down south to my people down in Fort Worth, Texas, and even over in Gulfport, Mississippi. Those guys have what we call a comprehensive housing strategy that touches all the elements that make up their housing market. What does that cohesive strategy look like? and how does it demonstrate equity for everybody, regardless of where you are in the socioeconomic status and what your race, gender, identity is. And that's something we don't have in Omaha or in our region. And I've raised that issue a number of times. I was hopeful that AFFH was going to get us there. For those who don't know what AFFH is, I typed it in there, but it's essentially, it's a HUD law that's been on the books since the enactment of the Fair Housing Act, which is, affirmatively furthering fair housing. Essentially what it says is all of these metropolitan areas that receive HUD money, you have an obligation to collaborate to tear down longstanding barriers. Well, for 50 plus years, HUD just turned a blind eye to it. We didn't enforce it. We really didn't hold folks accountable. And the best way to hold them accountable is withhold their funds. And we didn't. The previous administration came in and said, we're going to finally put some teeth to this particular policy. And I think people like MAPA, our regional partners, a lot of us were excited because for the first time, it was going to require all elements of our housing community, a housing market, public housing, subsidized housing providers, developers, landlords, the city, quasi-government like MAPA, all of us, even transit guys, all of us were going to have to get into a room and figure out what does this comprehensive strategy look like. Otherwise, nobody was getting HUD money until we figured this thing out. Well, lo and behold, the winds turn left instead of right, and then we have a change in direction on what that looks like. But I think, Jeff, to your question, that comprehensive housing strategy, which we don't have, and I believe the AFFH was going to get us there, or at least help get us there.
Yeah, it seemed to bring a lot more people to the conversation than before.
I have a question. I'm trying to, I like to think of myself as pretty aware, but I have to tell you, this book has made me more aware. I knew I have lived in most of the cities he gives as an example. If I haven't lived there, I've worked there. Meaning I used to travel a lot for work for about 20 years, working with low-income communities trying to build schools. And this book is making me just rethink everything. I think I've been fortunate in that I was able to buy a home, but now I think I was really lucky now that I know what was against me. And I'm new here in Omaha, and I haven't bought a home here yet, but I have talked to my bank, and it was so interesting because I've owned my own home for over 20 years until I changed jobs here. And the amount of my salary hasn't changed when I relocated. And the amount that I was eligible for a mortgage in Chicago was $400,000. And here it was $250,000. So I asked the bank, I was like, really? What? And there was never given an explanation. So this is, and I don't have any debt. I don't have any debt. So I'm feeling hopeless. Is there any strategy? Is there anything that can be done? It feels like the odds are stacked against middle class Black and brown people or working class Black and brown people ever owning their home. And the only way you're going to achieve any economic security is through owning your home as the base for that. And I don't know. I'm maybe at the end of the book there's an answer, but right now I'm seeing no answer. I mean, I mean,
Actually,
I'm
more.
really fortunate that I evidently ever owned a home, and my son owns homes, you know, but he was in the military. He's not in the military anymore,
right.
And he always lives in an all-white community. I'm afraid for him, and I don't know why he gets the loans. Maybe they just give him the loans, but I'm gonna have to ask him. I'm gonna have him read this book and say, "Oh boy, you lucky you even got a loan." So I don't know. I don't know. I just want to hope. Is anything hopeful? What's hopeful? Is anything happening that with?
I'm more hopeful. I mean, believe it or not, we've made progress. But I think what I've heard from the Omaha community is we've made progress, but by no means is the work done. And it really isn't. So yes, I'm more hopeful than not about those opportunities for Black and brown folks to participate in home ownership. And if anybody on here knows me and have heard me, the first thing I talk about in the whole housing concept is ownership. Then we get to these other elements, because without owning, you really never get to participate in this generation of wealth for the most part.
No.
But yeah, there's hope, and I listed those communities for a reason, because those communities, maybe with the exception of Minneapolis, I don't know what the demographics in Denver are. Maybe they're a little more diverse than we are, but their demographics are not all that different from ours, excluding Minneapolis. So they got it done. There were people from all different backgrounds that got together and made that thing happen. It started with leadership, local voices, thoughtful elected leaders who listened to this stuff, the community galvanizing itself and saying, no, we're not taking this stuff anymore. If you're not going to listen to us, then we're going to elect the right leadership that will. And then we're going to put the right people in place who can move this thing down the field. And it's not, I'm saying it's not rocket science, because we're not doing something from scratch. There are models we can look at how people did it, but we want to fashion our own policy that's unique and works for Omaha. Because what worked in Denver may not work in Omaha, but we can use how they did that to fashion those particular policies. So yes, I'm very hopeful. But it's going to take all these faces and then all of our other faces and all of our networks to come together to make that thing happen.
But the other thing that I'm learning, and I thought I knew something, is that people are totally unaware of why the current state exists. They assign it to individual blame of a group of people, when there is 100 years in this book, 50 of them I've been here, or more than 50 of them, that said it was planned. I'm not even sure Black people know about it. I knew something about it, but I didn't know it into the detail that this book is going through. Right. And so people, you don't even talk about this. I mean, you talk about it from a deficit of, oh, the people, well, I'm dominating the conversation. Oh, the people need help because they don't get it. But no, they don't get it because it's designed to be that way. They don't know. I mean, the system is rigged. But anyway, I'm sorry. I'm not going to say any more else. I'm going to be silent for the other 30 minutes or whatever. But it is.
Education and knowledge has to be a component of whatever you're doing, because there are a lot of us that don't know, regardless of where you come from or who you are. And I just explained to you that there are folks that work in my space with me at a HUD that have no knowledge of redlining because they don't work in that particular division, and nobody's ever read or helped them understand that. They don't know what blockbusting is, right? I've never heard of the term of white flight and all this other stuff. So I can take this book and present it to a good portion of the folks at my agency who don't work in our fair housing department, and for the most part have never heard of most of this stuff. They do and process what they have to do. But whatever we do, education, public, what do we call it? Outreach. Education and outreach has to be a huge component of whatever it is that we decide to do.
So Earl, I'm on this. What I think, what I like here, what Portia says, it's like there's this, it's like invisible. It's like in the air, but you can't see it. But it's these obstacles that are all around. And I recall some data you had around 2015 that was the number, it's by race in Omaha. And it was applications for a mortgage versus made it all the way through completion into, and that I want to say it was like 91 people that were Black applied for a home mortgage in 2015.
Loan originations is what you're talking about.
Yeah,
yes.
so
that's a telltale sign.
I'm like, that access to the home ownership that you talked about, and this what you just talked about, outreach, made me think of this, because my question is, what role does HUD play in helping push lending institutions to make decisions that are really based in equity, and like equity is in, some type of justice, not financial equity necessarily?
I don't know.
Turn that around.
Yeah, I don't know to what extent HUD does, because that would be quite a bit above my pay grade. I told you I was a paid minion. But I can tell you that we do collect the data, and depending on what region you're in, depending on who's looking at that data and harnessing attention to that data. In our region, which includes Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, we have a fine group of fair housing folks who we talk about that data quite a bit. And if you remember, just last year, maybe year before last, we had several settlements with lending institutions around this issue. Wells Fargo was one, Bank of America was another, and there was a third bank.
Countrywide?
Say again?
Was it Countrywide?
I don't know. It was three, and they were sizable settlements around this very issue, Jeff, because you're absolutely correct. I can pull the data, and actually anybody can. It's public data. EFFC, I think it's EFFC.gov. I'll send it to you, Jeff. You can send it out. I just want to make sure everybody has a website. But it's public held data that federally insured institutions are supposed to compile and report. And anybody can just go in there and look at that stuff. And I just decided to, if we're going to do something around home ownership, what does it look like with folks accessing the home ownership market? And the numbers were abysmal, right? I think African Americans at the time made up 9% of the population, but only were accessing loans at a rate of less than 2%. Our Hispanic population was like 13 or 14% at the time, and similar rates as a little bit more than African Americans at the time, but still far behind their representation of the population. If you stay that course over a decade or two, you just can imagine that housing disparity, especially when we talk about home ownership, is going to increase. Disparity is going to increase, and then that wealth gap is going to increase with it. So, yeah, that was a fascinating run we did with the data. But interestingly, Jeff, that initial data we pulled from 2015, it's almost identical for 2018. I think 2018 is the last year. 2019 is not out yet. But it hadn't changed much in 3 years. Statistically, it's about the same.
It's just really important to see, because I think about, like, as some of this white, like, interrogating my own self, like, so how did I end up where I am in my family? And I had a stable upbringing. I was in a home that was owned by my family, and this is wealth that would be passed down, like, most people, this American dream that was talked about last week, this idea of this American dream that's a myth. But it'd be just important for us to really think about there's no such thing really as a self-made man. That I didn't just get it by my own hard work. It was these systems that were set up and designed, like you said, to favor people like me. I think it's just vital for people to reflect on that in their own.
One thing I would ask of all of our white allies who are on this call: this work doesn't go anywhere without you all. And I may be driving off course just a little bit, but I, as a social science adjunct guy, we spend a lot of time in this space. But this doesn't go anywhere without you all. And it may be uncomfortable. It may, you may feel attacked at some point in time. And you be like, I didn't create this system. No, none of us did, because none of us are here. But there are still folks who benefit from a system that was created, 200, 300, 400 years ago. And then there are other folks who are still suffering or being oppressed under that system. And we have to revise that system, starting locally and one step at a time. Otherwise, man, we're just wasting a lot of time on Zoom talking about stuff and we ain't gonna do anything about it.
Earl, I appreciate that. My name's Ben, and I'm a priest in the Episcopal Church out in Elkhorn, kind of West Omaha. I'm becoming aware. I'm just reading a lot right now, and I'm trying to find terms that I can work with, and I'm trying to figure out how to lead a church community through this, which includes everybody from people who are way ahead of where I am, with some pretty good anti-racism training in my formation, to people who are, pretty resistant and defended to the idea that this is even a problem because we had a Black president. So, that's the spectrum. I know I'm not saying anything new to you, but I'm pretty convicted both by the receipts that books like this one bring. I mean, it's just, there's so much data, right? And I think, the color of law books, as I'm reading it, the thrust seems to be, this is a de jure problem. It was created by law and policy and not just the social force of racism in the past. And therefore it's appropriate to have de jure solutions. And I'm on board. And I feel like another really helpful definition I'm getting is the one that's coming from people like Ibram X. Kendi and others, who are really pushing me to think of, non-racist doesn't exist, which I've kind of been able to nod along with for a while. But I think what's amazing about the work he does is talking about how basically the system has a direction, right? The system has a possession arrow. The system is moving itself in a self-reinforcing way into more racism. And the only way to kind of not have that be the direction that we are on is to actively create anti-racist momentum and work. And I guess I'm further feeling pushed to really start using the term white supremacist racism in every conversation, because I think people are afraid of what that means in a different way than they're afraid of kind of bland racism. And I think when people hear that we have a racist system, they can kind of nod, but when they hear that we have a white supremacist system, they kind of go, wait a minute.
I'm not white supremacist.
Right. And what race do they think is on top in the racist system? So I'm kind of, I'm trying to challenge myself with the discomfort of that more. And I'm trying to challenge myself and, eventually my parish more with the idea that non-action is participation. And sort of silence is complicity and all these, I mean, these are things people know, but for some reason, the blind spot that's been allowed to grow around this is such an American blind spot for white people. And I don't know how much other communities are internalizing it too, but for white people, it's such a blind spot. I'm sorry, I'm putting a lot on the table there. But.
No, I would say two things to that. And I think all of us have to think about this. Before I share those two things, data, right? Data, and somebody else said education, awareness, really has helped transform my discussions and getting folks to lean in. My first 2 years in Omaha, I would just come in and talk to folks, I'm like, HUD, this is, we got resources. We're bringing some money to the table. And I'm just thinking everybody got to jump in this boat and paddle with me. I couldn't have been more wrong. But once we started looking at this thing regionally with maps, and we mapped all of this stuff out, and MAPPA was in the lead, partnering with HUD, and we started revealing what this data looked like over, the last 50 or so years. Then we started having different conversations, because not only are you listening to some old bald guy from Texas, but he's actually showing you what happened with data points. And you can argue the data points all you want to, but all you gotta do is drive around the city. You see those data points played out just as they've explained to you. So I think that's been very helpful in having an informed conversation, because talking to folks about this stuff and then showing them and then helping them read and learn and know for themselves, you know, is altogether different.
But Earl,
go ahead.
I'm going to push back on you there as another person of color.
Go ahead.
Also, what I also see is that, and I think to Ben's point, Kendi would say that we need to be disruptive of the status quo, that we have to be intentional about how you present that data, but also understanding that a lot of people are, even with the facts, they're not going to accept them because it's going to challenge the very kind of sense of who they are. It's going to challenge their identity. And so when Ben talks about white supremacist racism, that's the third rail right there in American society. And so I think what we have to start doing is preparing ourselves for the initial pushback on that and have an answer for it. And to be humane and to have empathy, try to understand why that makes people uncomfortable. I'm not trying to take anything away from you. I'm trying to point out to you that there's an inherent discrepancy and inequity in how we organize ourselves in society. And so for me, that's the challenge here. I mean, this book makes me so angry. I get done reading the book and I got to go take like a 3-mile walk. Because I'm just like going, man, you know, I mean, people have been getting had for years on end.
There's a series of them that'll do that to me, but yeah.
Well, this is one of those books that's doing it to me. And so I just want to be open to the idea that, you know, in my own institution, as I began to kind of articulate that notion of this being institutional in nature and how do I dismantle it, how do I disrupt it, but also knowing that I'm going to get pushback. Because these people are educated, they're articulate, they have wealth behind them that they're going to fall back on as their defense mechanism.
Approach is everything. And who is the person that is leading these conversations? You are right. You're right, Dr. J. It's not going to be easy. If folks start with, well, you know, we're going to, even if we just violently disrupt the system right now, we're going to get these right-sized policies. No, you're not. One, because we're not in charge. We don't own anything, right? And we're still the minority. Unless we have allies all across the board, right? Then we have folks working from different points. You have folks who, you know, my pastor, refers to as agitators. Every movement has its group of agitators. Then you have folks who are working behind the scenes on policy re-enhancement. And then you have folks who are out front leading the charge. So you're absolutely correct. There are going to be folks, you know, I say that, you know, the train is going to depart the station at some point. How and when you get on board and what conditions is up to you. I don't know how long that's going to take. This train has been parked or maybe it moved up to the next station over the last 100 years, but we certainly are not rolling down the train tracks like we need to be. But it will depart at some point. And either folks are going to get on or off or not get on at all. So you're absolutely correct. And then it does depend on approach, how you approach that thing. But I've seen in my experience, it's been helpful, even if folks don't like what I have to say, my messaging, when I have tried to bring a sense of awareness to data, information. I may decide to pull somebody else with me. I've found that those conversations went a little differently. Even if they didn't buy into it, I didn't normally get the huge amount of hostility or pushback as just trying to have this conversation without that supportive piece.
Pardon me. I might just follow up with a quick question to Earl to the point about challenging your own institution with data and things. While we've got you on the call, in these last 6-8 weeks, I mean, with all the energy and momentum around George Floyd and the protests and the public conversation, do you feel like there have been more opportunities to sort of wag the dog from the fair housing position to the broader housing institution?
I think as you all probably know by now, all of these systems work in some type of cohesive, smooth operating piece, so that if we're talking about education, housing, access to health, economic stability. All of those things kind of depend and grease one another. So while you may have one particular piece in law enforcement or crime and justice that's really garnering a lot of attention, we can't be dismissive and forget the fact that we still have all these other issues that have huge disparities, and they are continuing to evolve and move, maybe not at the same speed or with the same attention, but all of those things happen together. You know, I think folks, we got health folks on the call, they call that social determinants of health. All of those things are still continuing to inform and impact the community. And while only one may be getting the attention of the spotlight now, the rest of them are still operating. So I guess the answer to your question is we could, but which are we going to tackle first? Or are we operating and running all of them parallelly?
But like within your organization, people aren't turning to you and saying like, hey, you're the guy who knows something about this. Like, can you help educate us right now? Like you're not getting those kind of moments.
I don't, but I'm a bit more proactive. So like with my staff, matter of fact, I have a call with them tomorrow, but I have quarterly calls with my staff here in Omaha. I can't speak for the other offices, 50 some offices across the country, but I'm very proactive, and I take my leadership role seriously, and I help myself and my team lean into these spaces. So tomorrow, I've been very thoughtful, and we're going to have this conversation about what we've seen transpire in our country in the last 6 to 8 weeks. So I don't give them a chance to say, no, this doesn't impact me. Yeah, it does. It impacts all of us.
Thinking about the some of the conversation the last few minutes that Ben has and Earl talk about your pastor using the term agitators. I mean, this this section of the book talks about the role of faith communities in upholding these kind of racist policies, and this belief that because you're an organization that's the assumption is that you provide a public good to your community in exchange for tax exemption. And he in chapter 5 highlights a number of examples in Chicago and St. Louis and so on that where churches, primarily churches, are were a part of financing sometimes lawsuits against these like the effort to overturn these covenants. I'm wondering, like, this book study is hosted by the Tri-Faith Initiative and Urban Abbey, like, so there's how maybe we could reflect on that for a moment, like what role do we see faith communities having in their access to social capital and people coming together for imagining a better world in some fashion. How do we do that, and what can we do for next steps? So I'm curious for like a larger conversation around that idea.
Can I pipe in
a
little bit?
Please do.
I don't think I introduced myself today, and I wasn't here last time. I'm Wendy Goldberg. I'm the executive director of Tri-Faith. And welcome to all of you. What a fascinating conversation. Earl, thank you for being with us today. Certainly, so many things have been uncovered in the last several weeks. The inequities that we all know have existed. We're trying to come to grips with as we prepare for the pain that is ahead. And I think even before we get to opportunities for home ownership in the city, we're going to have to address the evictions that are forthcoming. And I think that as I'm kind of sitting listening to this conversation, talking about you representing a federal organization, when we have such poor communication between what a neighborhood looks like and what a community looks like, and the mayor's role versus the governor's role versus the president's role, and even the conversation of masks, let alone housing insecurity, and the fierce battle that we're having for justice. I guess what I would want to know from you is as people from faith communities where the neighborhood model is the tri-faith model, what are things that you could propose that we could move forward as a community to use our social influence and social capital towards good? And those can be in micro bites. But what suggestions do you have for us as individuals and as faith community?
I think, as Ben kind of mentioned, I think a self-examination of the respective places of worship you lead first, right? We have to be able to have those candid conversations within our own houses before we're going to be able to mobilize, galvanize, and then go out and collaborate with other folks to really topple this system. My understanding and my reading is that a lot of our, especially in the Southern Confederacy, a lot of our faith-based leaders, they passed, right? They made justification, religious justifications for slavery and other inhumane treatment of a large group of minority races. And that stuff stayed with us for a long time. And here we are. But as we turned the century and we got into the 60s and the 70s, we saw faith-based leaders do something different. And we have to continue to see that model. And there's excellent examples across the country where some of our mega institutions in faith are demanding and holding community leaders, elected officials, and even residents of the community, holding them accountable to the tenets of the faith we live by, or just humane treatment for all of us. And I think our faith-based institutions have a significant role in making that happen, absolutely.
So I'll give you all a little preview that myself and some other faith leaders have had some preliminary conversations with the mayor about having a more regular audience of the impact that the faith community very broadly can have on Omaha. And we intend to have your support in multiple voices. We realize that that isn't just Tri-Faith in West Omaha, that this is a way to come together between North Omaha and South Omaha with West Omaha, and that there's not a monolith to faith. And that's complicated. It's hard work to bring those voices together, but perhaps this is the moment and this is the topic that we could rally around.
I would love to see more of those candid conversations in-house first with those faith-based respective institutions. I've been around the globe, and I've participated in a number of different places of worship, and yeah, I think having those in-house first would be very helpful as a starting point. But definitely your collaborative strength and leadership and your ability to lean on the political will of folks in power absolutely will have an impact in changing things, no doubt about it.
Are there cities we should be looking for that are doing that well?
I think I have a couple of pieces of paper at the office. I'll have to find them on some work similar in this space.
Thank
you. And I want to say New Orleans was one, especially after the horrific events of Hurricane Katrina. And I believe it was another institution down in the South, or community down in the Southeast corridor, that I remember reading about post-Hurricane Katrina. I'll see if I can find that, though. It's been a while.
Thanks.
I just have one question about the in-house, and Earl, thank you so much, and Wendy, so glad to hear, and Jeff bringing this up about how these faith-based communities need to be active and supportive in moving things forward. The only question I have about in-house first is that if there isn't large representation of people of color in your congregation or in your organization, and I'm not speaking for any particular organization, I'm an arts educator who's worked in all states before, and looked at numerous neighborhoods and went to church with numerous people that I worked with in different states. And it was you know, the divide is there too. And if you don't have representation of people that may better understand what the issues are, how can you even be sure that the deeper conversation, we've got a book here that can guide us, but that we will truly understand what the challenges are and where the root of them is. I mean, I'm consistently blown away by how deep and how far back we go and how racist these laws were and upheld still even today. And I think, like you were talking about property values and property taxes earlier, to the people who are putting, you know, valuing that, I'm sure they have a strict protocol they have to follow. Was that protocol designed by somebody who understood these issues and tried to keep them alive, or is trying to address these issues? Meanwhile, somebody's following a protocol they've been trained on in their job, and they don't even realize where that's come from. So I'm just wondering how we have that conversation first internally if we may not have the perspective to understand how to move forward.
I think that's a good question. And I'd like Dr. Jonathan to chime in if he wants as well. I love his perspective on this. But what I would offer you is this: if you don't have people in-house that can lead that, because I think, you know, this whole tenet of my faith talked about addressing your own house first before you walk out the door to address the issues of your community. If you don't have that perspective in-house, then go and find it. We have a plethora of folks in the Omaha community that can go anywhere you want them to help facilitate this conversation. As well as there are a number of you on this particular link today and across our city. You may not be a person of color, but I know a lot of white folks across our community who have the cultural intelligence and the cultural context to facilitate this conversation, right? So I don't think you necessarily, there's a way to do that, but I think, I say we have to start in-house, but there may be folks who disagree. Dr. J, your thoughts on that?
You know, I had the opportunity to preach at the Urban Abbey on Father's Day, and what I wanted to talk about that day was the fact that, you know, Sunday still is the most segregated hour in America, you know, 11 o'clock. And then it's required of us, if we're truly going to move the needle in any meaningful way, to get out of our comfort zone and to really go where, to meet people where they're at. We can certainly sit and pontificate about, you know, what we will do when we get to that moment, but until we get there, it's just talk.
Right.
And so I think we have to be very intentional about how we're going to act upon the values and the beliefs that we extol and we share with others. You know, I think the book has really helped me to kind of clarify that, even more so than it did already, you know, but I was, you know, it was hard to write that because it was also a self-criticism. You know, because in spite of the fact that I'm a brown man, I'm extremely privileged. You know, I've got access to things that a vast majority of people that walk the planet will never have in their lives. And I'm cognizant and aware of it. And yet, you know, we still face all these different kinds of things that are completely out of our control, things that are not of our making. And so I like the thrust of this conversation. Especially Wendy, I appreciate your points and really kind of, you know, because I think it's going to take a collective effort of multiple faith communities simultaneously pushing in the same direction with the support of government agencies and policies that will back people up. Now that's a lot of work.
But I mean, there's a lot good going on. You know, I think that, you know, the Omaha Chamber has intention to understand what the conversation around diversity has to bring to the city, and yet they're waiting for leaders like the people on this call to show up and guide, and so that we can amplify those voices. And you know, I think the good news is that the last 6 weeks have made me feel like we're not going to wait a generation for that change.
I agree with everything you all are saying. It's definitely going to take a collaborative effort. Collectively, we have to get this done, and it's going to take as many institutions, as many different people from many different backgrounds, from many different environments to make this work. Just my experience in the things I've done at Highlight, asking folks to, and even at school, I've challenged my kids that come through my class. The first time I sent them out in the community, I just sent them out without actually having this informed conversation with them about what they were about to experience. And what I took from that is it didn't go well. There's probably a better way to do that. If I can have a conversation with them first, prepare them for what they're about to intersect with, it went really well. And that's been my experience in this housing piece, and getting folks and communities together, that you got to have a conversation with self or your own house first. Because once you walk out there and if you never been to North or South Omaha, or I live downtown, come downtown. I came downtown and see the intersection of, professionals and homelessness and different folks. You might be in for, a shock and not prepared to, what am I seeing? How do I deal with this? That's all I'm saying. But all of you all are right.
Well, great. Well, thank you everybody for this conversation. We went a few minutes over, but I think it was well worth it. And so I think we'll wrap up the conversation there tonight. Well, Earl, thank you so much for coming and sharing some of your perspective and being available to, answer some of these questions about, the role of how we work with local community leaders, and some of your experience on these issues is great. So as we move to next week, shorter reading chapters for next week. This week was the longest one here, but if you want to catch up, you can read through chapters 9 and 10. It's going to go look at, not just how, some of these policies kind of work their way out, sort of implicitly or explicitly, but also how some of the violence that people really were trying to escape in the Great Migration coming from the South, really was expressed in northern cities as well. And so there's a little bit about that. And then also getting back to some of this economic argument about, suppression of incomes and all of these economic factors really kind of weighing on Black and brown families, and really kind of what that means. We're also going to have some discussion where, sort of trying to pick up some of these threads that we hear about. We're going to kind of pick up some of these conversations about urban renewal things. There's some chapters devoted to freeway projects and slum clearing projects of the mid-century, and how that intersects with some of these housing issues. And then also education, kind of retouching on that central theme that we've been kind of revisiting as well. So we're going to try to keep some of the many multitude of discussion items going through, but hopefully the next couple of chapters will stoke some new questions, and we'll continue to have kind of a great discussion. I feel like this is one of the best weeks yet. So thank you all for your time tonight, and thank you again to Earl.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
One little piece here, that as you're inspired by these conversations and have access to other books or people, we are looking, ongoing to continue programming around this area, particularly around the intersection of religion and race. And so if you have ideas of things that you would love to read with a group, please feel free to shoot me a note or Sierra a note. We'd like to help make those things happen and continue this conversation beyond the weeks that are here, because we won't finish the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Yes, thank you all so much. I will send out an email tomorrow, and then again next week.